Thanks for inviting me. I'm sorry I'm in the Midlands of England rather than Montreal, but that's the way it goes. I should say before I start that the co-authors here are very much co-authors on papers relating to the wider project and project members and leaders, rather than people who are responsible for this presentation. I should, given two of them are in the room, I should make that disclaimer immediately for their sakes, I think. So, as this is a session, this is a session on disruptions to the field of HRM. I tried to sort of edit this presentation in that manner and to try and emphasize more general things for HRM. We will, of course, see if that works. So what I wanted to say, because obviously doing this remotely is not ideal, and people might stop listening quite soon. So I thought I'd put the conclusions at the beginning. The broad argument that I am making here, I think most of it's shared by my co-authors. International HRM tends to focus either on the management of international staff, particularly international managers, which I think is the literature that most of the people liable to be in this room are less interested in, and more interestingly on the transfer or non-transfer of employment policies, and to some extent industrial relations. I'm going to argue that, like HRM in general, it tends to neglect work relations. It tends to focus, as we've argued in written work, it tends to focus on headquarters to subsidiary, country to country transfer or transfer of policies. We argue through our research, this is increasingly not how many contemporary multinationals organize production and organize work, that at least many multinationals, particularly in the service sector and particularly in professional work, tend to approximate to what I'm going to call more liquid forms of organization. And these require more flexible approaches to methodologically and more flexible frameworks for research. And the arguments here are based on the Globalizing Access in Multinationals project, of which Tony, who is in the room, was the principal investigator, and Olga Tregaskis, I believe, was also here, was also part. I'm not going to talk through the project in any great detail. There are publications that are on the last slide here, should people wish to read them. I'm going to try to be somewhat more conversational about HRM, but we do have an extensive evidence base based on a very large number of interviews conducted over a period of at least 5 years. So international HRM is a big subfield. If we look at the more sort of IR, industrial relations adjacent part of the international management literature, rather than the more purely managerialist literature, multinationals are seen as sources of global pressures on employment practices. Firstly, via their transfer of HR and employment policies across different national systems, and that's led to fairly extensive literatures by now, of which obviously I played some part myself, of arguments around country of origin versus host country effects, arguments about the hybridization of policies and practices as they transfer across national borders. And the more interesting of that literature tends to talk a lot also about organizational politics or micro-politics as firms seek to transfer policies. Additionally, the more critically oriented literature also looks at the effects of what I and colleagues have called in the past in different work, locational flexibility. So the coercive comparisons that multinationals sometimes make between productivity, efficiency, sometimes labor regimes in different countries in order to optimize the outcomes for themselves, and the spectre and in many cases reality of regime shopping as firms seek the places where the labor regimes, tax regimes, other regimes are more compatible with their goals. What we're going to say is, well, while all that research is fine and is well and good, and we're not trying to say that all that suddenly has gone out of the window. What that sort of IR adjacent international HR literature tends to ignore is, in one way, is the realities of work in many contemporary multinationals. So what I've called in previous presentations the banal globalization of work in many contemporary multinationals. So this is where work groups are spread across multiple countries, multiple continents. People are working in real time across continents. Their managers may be people from another continent that they've never met, and this stuff is very different to the sort of large-scale manufacturing model prevalent in the international HR literature of opening a new subsidiary somewhere. This is much more micro than that. We're often talking about work that's based on project-based means of coordination. And we're often, in a way, talking about relatively junior organizational members, often professionals, whose work, in a sense, involves coping organizationally with requirements that are coming to them from above, finding fast solutions to problems that the central bureaucracies of an international firm, the old headquarters, the old subsidiary senior managers don't necessarily even know anything about. So the central bureaucracies of the international hierarchy are certainly unable to account for fully, and often will have very little idea at all about the nature of the precise form of work organization that's happening under them. And I think this is a more general point as well with regard to HRM. In complex work, and certainly in professional work, how often does your line manager know what you're actually supposed to be doing, let alone what you are actually doing? So it's said fairly large numbers of people within multinationals are involved in managing operational work which routinely crosses national borders. These people are not what textbooks and what the conventional literature would call international managers. They sit well outside the scope of the international management cadres involved in formal policy transfer, but they have to set or adapt norms governing work relations, the pace of work, distribution of work, how performance is managed, etc. Another complication to this headquarter subsidiary pattern is that changes in HR norms, particularly perhaps in this sort of firm, often involve local or business unit champions, other sorts of project groups that sit slightly outside the traditional hierarchy. I'm not going to talk about that a lot here because of time, but that's another factor sort of complicating the picture of HR diffusion across the globe. And what Tony, myself, and other colleagues in the project have argued is the population of what we call globalizing actors, so that's people involved in the creation, implementation, and diffusion of global norms, is very much larger, it's very much less elite, and it's very much more variegated than the population of so-called international managers. So you're talking about a much larger group, you're talking often about relatively junior people. So to cut a very long story short, at least in some sectors, global work has been basically routinized. It's banal, it's what people do every day. They don't really think about it as global. But generally, at least in the firms we looked at, it's been done without training. There's almost no training and development related to the international aspects of such work, and largely without recognition either. There are, from a managerial perspective, there are serious questions of competence and capabilities. And I think also there are sorts of interesting sociological questions about how this mess, if you like, how this globalized mess affects professional and occupational identity. So what we're saying is there's a tendency, for the geography of the workplace, the local office, the factory floor, etc., being replaced by a virtual landscape. Now, many of these people may go physically into an office, but they won't necessarily be in even vaguely similar functions in the same departments as the people that they might sit in the next office to. So the local completion, what used to be called the local completion of the effort reward bargain, or Boxall and Patel, or the wage effort bargain to industrial relations scholars, occurs in a fairly disembodied way, mediated by ICT platforms. So we think, I presume I'm running out of time, we think that the fluidity of organization, particularly in these service sector multinationals based around technical or professional work, means we need to rethink how we're looking at HR. So Tony's developed the maxim, assume less, explore more, which would be a good maxim for research on many subjects, but particularly this one. And we argue, and I'm not obviously going to go into exactly what we did, the routes that we've taken specifically, but we think that research needs to follow the story of particular work processes, particular projects, etc., rather than assuming that role holders in the standard sort of Chandlerian formal hierarchy are going to be the most decisive or knowledgeable from the point of view of research actors, because often a national HR function for a subsidiary is in reality quite marginalized, not particularly relevant in terms of knowing what's going on in the multinational, which is a bit of a problem if you're basing your survey or case study on information from them. And we also think, and I'm obviously happy to talk about this more in the discussion, this needs more flexible concepts to capture the dynamics of power, the dynamics of micro-negotiation that are going on within norm making. So we need to have methodologies and theoretical frameworks that allow us to flexibly capture who's involved in the arena or the field, who has power, who has authority, who can develop the authority, either through hierarchical position, through social skill or something else, to affect the way in which norms develop across the world. In deference to the to the chair of this session, which I should point out one of the bets that we've taken is a strategic action fields framework of external macadam, which we think allows us to capture that fluidity. I shall stop there, Sarah, and obviously I'm happy to discuss in whatever format you see fit.